In this video, we are going to talk about the archaic phenomenon of tyranny. So we've been looking at the polis and the nature of it, and we saw how the political and social structure of the polis in the archaic period produces a lot of class tension, because the hoi agathoi have so much wealth, so much power, and everyone else is left with not that much whatsoever. Things are sort of prime for change, I will say. In a period beginning around 670 to 500 BC, that 170 years, we see across a number of city-states in the ancient Greek world the phenomenon of tyranny. And so when we talk about tyranny or a tyrant in ancient Greece, we mean a situation in which one man illegally seizes power in the city. Okay. This man, this person who then becomes tyrant of the city, tends to be from an aristocratic family. And frequently, it's not just the tension between classes that gives rise to tyranny, but even the tension within classes. So the aristocratic families, the hoi agathoi, they're also often striving against each other for power. And so sometimes one man will essentially emerge to put the other families in check. And this is bad for the other aristocrats who are not part of his family, because they are frequently killed or exiled or lose their property, but it tends to be good for the hoi polloi, for the mesoi and the kakoi, the lower classes, because these tyrants tend to seize power by whipping up the hoi polloi as their political support base. They say, I am going to make things better for you, you support me during this coup, during this takeover, and that's where they get their support from. Now, sometimes they also bring in mercenaries from outside the city. You can even call on maybe other tyrants for help, and we have examples of that. The Diogenes, the tyrant of Megara, for instance, sent mercenaries to help a guy named Chilon try to take over the city of Athens. He wasn't successful, but we have records and evidence of that kind of interplay in the ancient world. So, once you, as a tyrant, let's say you're a tyrant and you're sick of the other aristocratic families, so you decided to declare yourself ruler, you get support from the hoi polloi, and you promise them all sorts of things, and one of the first things you do is secure your position by getting rid of all the other aristocrats. You exile them and or kill them if you can, if they didn't run away. Now, what do you do as a ruler? The term tyrant is fairly misleading to a modern English-speaking audience, because in our mind a tyrant is someone very bad, and who rules viciously and cruelly and oppressively. But that's not what an ancient Greek tyrant means. The Greek word tyrannos just means a ruler, right? And it doesn't necessarily have that kind of negative baggage with it. And in fact, in terms of most people, the tyrants rule fairly well. In terms of the health of the city, in reducing civil tension, in helping out the lower classes, the tyrants rule really well. So for one thing, they attack the rich. And so they temporarily sort of drive out the aristocracy, usually, and they take their land. They often redistribute land. One of the big complaints is that wealthy families are hoarding land and everyone else is running out of it. So if you take a chunk of land and suddenly redistribute it to people, now a lot more people have land and it's not all hoarded up by a small group of families. So that's great for everyone that is not the aristocratic family that lost their land, I guess. They also will then put in place laws that limit aristocratic power often. The kind of aristocratic excess that angers people normally will be limited by laws that are put in place by the tyrant, so that it can't happen again, hopefully. Tyrants often put building projects into place, and these can be things like big temples, these can be things like the fortification systems, this can be the streets, the harbors, the sewage system. All of these are improvements to the city. They're also a source of jobs for the very poor. The government pays them to work on these things. And they're morale improvers, right? When you live in a city and it looks really nice and pretty and it's something you can be proud of, that's great for the morale of the people. They often encourage crafts and trade. So in order to make the city prosperous, they will encourage trade in various ways. Sometimes they set up trading posts or colonies in other places in the world so that they can have access to resources, or create new markets, access new markets to sell goods. Sometimes they will make agreements with other city-states, other polis, to trade with each other, and so create these kind of trading networks. Sometimes they will standardize weights and measures so that there's a kind of standard that everyone uses that fits in with what everyone else is using, that makes exchanges across the Eastern Mediterranean simplified so that their merchants are able to trade with more people. They also will sometimes support the development of a really lucrative industry, say pottery or olive oil, because they know there's a lot of demand for that, and so if their city focuses on the creation of those goods, they can get a lot of money into the city by selling it abroad. So this kind of economic reform is also characteristic of tyrants. A lot of them will introduce some new religious cults and festivals. These are, again, morale boosters, right? They make the city look good. It's something you can be proud of. It also unites the city. Religion is often a unifying force in the ancient world because everyone comes together to celebrate communally. And so it unites the city and makes everyone sort of appeased with their rule. They're often patrons of the arts. And they will patronize not just the building of new buildings, as we mentioned, but commissioning art and then literature, right? So they're frequently patronizing poets who will come and stay at their court and produce poetry. So we have a number of examples of that as well. Another thing that they do is tyrants tend to avoid war. They don't want to get caught up in war because their position's a bit precarious because they're not the legal ruler. There's always the chance that their enemies from the other aristocratic families will hope to knock them out of their position. So they tend to avoid conflict. And this means a time of relative stability in the city, peace and stability. And it also tends to mean that they're not spending all their money on warfare, so they have money to build buildings and patronize things. These are some of the general trends. And like I said, this happens in many, many polis in this period. And it'll happen a little bit differently in each place. Let's look at the city of Corinth for an example. So in the city of Corinth, the Corinthian political structure was dominated not just by an aristocracy of many families, but one family. This Bacchiad clan controlled the entirety of the government. And when it had gotten involved in a fairly unpopular war with Corcyra and with Argos, there was a lot more unrest, and the position of the Bacchiads was a lot more unstable. And so amidst all this, in the city of Corinth, a guy named Kipsalis, who was a general in the Corinthian army, he drove out the Bacchiads and made himself ruler of the city. He was the tyrant of Corinth, and he seized power. So he began some reforms. They were continued especially by his son Periander, who took over after his father's death and ruled for a nice long time. And he did kind of all the things that we talked about. He set up colonies in the Aegean to exploit resources. He established trading networks with southern Italy. He built new temples. He patronized poets like Arrian, the poet. He instituted new religious games, the Isthmian Games. He very much supported the Corinthian pottery industry, which was a big economic boost for the city of Corinth. All sorts of projects that he undertook. Now, a lot of these tyrannies are short-lived. So sometimes when a tyrant dies, the rule will go to his son or his next male heir. But we don't know of a single tyranny that lasts beyond 3 generations. By that time, they are usually overthrown again. So why is this? Why don't they last longer, especially if tyrants are doing so much to help the city? Well, the answer is that generally by the 2nd or 3rd generation, these new tyrants, who are the sons, grandsons, etc. of the original tyrants, are just not as good. These sons are often just not as charismatic, not as forceful and effective. They also tend to grow a bit more tyrannical over time. The power kind of goes to their head, and they put in place more and more oppressive measures, and so they turn unpopular. So I said Kipsalis, his son Periander, took over after his death, and he did very well. But when Periander died, his nephew Psammetichus took over, and everyone hated him, and then he got overthrown. So it doesn't ever last beyond 3 generations. What happens at the end of the tyranny? In most cases, what happens is the aristocracy is reinstituted. Okay, aristocracy returns. These families, if they were in exile, return. They return to their old seats of power. They reestablish the aristocratic order of those families in charge. The magistracies and the boule, right? They all return to this state of affairs. But they are generally at this point curbed in their power, right? The tyrant may have passed laws that curbed their power and increased the power of the hoi polloi, allowed them to vote on more things, to elect people. They have some kind of say in the government. And some kind of concessions to improve their lives. And so the aristocracies return, but they have been balanced out a bit. And so in this way, they're allowed to thrive for much longer, right? Because they have been checked in some way before they just sort of burst apart. The major exception, and we're going to look at this one in detail, is in the city of Athens. The city of Athens has a tyrant, Pisistratus. The tyranny lasts actually into a second generation. His sons take over before they are gotten rid of because everyone hates them. And in the wake of that tyranny, they do not reestablish the aristocracy. They create a new form of government entirely, the democracy, right? And so we'll look at that a lot more closely in our next, well, we're not going to look at democracy, but we'll look at their tyranny in our next lecture. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.